hypothalamus, we were talking about the hypothalamus, and we went over the general anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, but always remember, right, putting it into a larger context, we've learned about the hypothalamus during the endocrine system, right, through the pituitary gland, and all those feedback cycles with the hormones circulating around the blood, right?
Professor, we can see your screen.
Classic.
Thank you.
That one, that hypothalamus, regulating the pituitary gland, right? And then, but, for our focus today, as far as the homeostasis of, on talking about the autonomic nervous system, right? The hypothalamic control over the autonomic nervous system, right? That is, right? The hypothalamus sitting up there, right below the thalamus, right there. It had those different groups of neurons, nuclei, right, that were controlling all sorts of different things. But the two we're interested in here are these this red cluster neurons here that sent their axons down into the brainstem or way down into the sacral region right there, and control the motor nuclei that control things like your eye dilation, or your tear and salivary gland for your cranial nerves, or different things with your pelvic area, right? Urination, defecation, stuff like that. Or that blue group here, bunch of nuclei, bunch of interneurons that control that, whose axons went out and passed through the brainstem, went down into the spinal cord in between T1 and L2, right? For that sympathetic neurons in the lateral horn of the spinal cord there. They in turn would send their axons out toward their targets, right? All sorts of targets, which we'll talk about today, right? So that was the control of your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system, right? Your autonomic nervous system. So again, keep concrete understanding of what we're talking about when I talk about control, visceral motor control over your viscera, right? Your guts, your hearts, your heart, singular, your lungs, and then all your abdominal stuff, right? Your liver, your stomach, your intestines, your pancreas. And then interspersed within all this is your blood vessels going through, right? So for like your blood vessels and your digestive tract, as well as your airways through here, they had these layers of smooth muscle, right? And that is what is basically being controlled by your autonomic nervous system, right? Contraction of your smooth muscle around these tubes, or beating of your heart right there, or secretion of the glands over there, right? So visceral motor, this means things like movement of your food, and when it becomes a bolus and chyme and feces and everything, moving it through your digestive tract through the contraction of the layers of the smooth muscle around that tube. Or there is muscular layers, right, around your blood vessels and airways, right? So you can control blood flow and airflow into any particular region. You want more air, you open up the tube. You want less air, you close it, right? Same thing with blood flow. And you're going to do that through this muscular layer. You're going to do that through these nerve signals, right? As well as hormonal stuff. But autonomic nervous system is controlling, right, the size of the tube so you can change the flow. Or in your heart, right? The special example of your heart, right? With that cardiac muscle, right? You can feel it right now. You put your hand on your heart, you feel that pumping. That's a contraction of the cardiac muscle, because your heart's this big pump that's going to squeeze out blood into your blood vessels, right? That's all due to contraction of the cardiac muscle. Again, even though this is auto-rhythmic, that is, it does it, even if you took it out of the body and put it in a dish, it would do this. We also have control to change the normal pace of that. So visceral motor, right? That's kind of the things you want to think of. And glands, right? Glandular secretions. Right. So if this is your gut tube, right? This is an exocrine gland, and it's secreting stuff, right? Maybe this is digestive enzymes, which are going to help digest food. Maybe it's stuff that's just gonna lubricate the lining right there, right? Maybe it's gonna be bicarbonate buffer, right? That's gonna neutralize acidic chyme or something. Maybe it's gonna be digestive enzymes, anything like that, right? Is gonna be going, it's gonna be controlled, right, by all these neurons coming in and having an effect on these, right? Visceral motor control. Visceral, as opposed to what? What would I oppose visceral motor control to?
Somatic.
Somatic, which would be what kind of muscle?
Voluntary.
What's that?
Voluntary.
Voluntary, it would be stuff you could control voluntary. What kind of muscle tissue would be opposed to smooth or cardiac? It would be
Skeletal.
skeletal, right? Skeletal muscle, right? Voluntary control, those skeletal things that are crossing all your joints and stuff, allowing you to move in the external environment, right? This is all this internal stuff, right? And it's involuntary. So for all that control, right, of your glands, of all the muscles, right, secretions and stuff like that, internal movement stuff, you know, this is going to be controlled by the hypothalamus's control over your autonomic nervous system, right? Your parasympathetic and your sympathetic division, or craniosacral division, or thoracolumbar division, right? And those are going to have an effect on these organs, right? And they're going to have, as we kind of briefly mentioned, right, they're going to work in opposition to each other. Right? So if one is constricting the pupils, like your oculomotor neuron, cranial nerve number 3, constricts the pupils, your cranial nerve number 7 and 9 secretes salivary glands, whereas somewhere in your sympathetic ganglia, the nerves go up here and do kind of the opposite thing, right? So they're usually working in opposite to each other, and ideally you want to maintain homeostatic conditions, right? If it gets out of range, you call in one, right? And then once everything's back into normal, you just keep everything cool with your parasympathetic division, right? Rest and digest, feed and breed, fight or flight. Those are the big sort of terms, but they're always working with each other, right? So this whole balance is what we refer to as the autonomic tone, right? This constant sort of interplay between the level of sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation and impulses at any one given moment, right? So when you really need to run away from a snake in this case, right, you need to charge up all your skeletal muscles. Your heart needs to increase, your blood, your airways need to get open to get more air in, right? You need to break down glucose. So your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, right? Once you're done with everything, you need to return to normal, right? Your parasympathetic is kicking in, you're digesting your food. So we're always in a balance, right? It's not just like fight or flight or rest and digest. There's always like constantly tweaking every little bits of every little system. So like if you were in war or something, active battle, right? Your sympathetic nervous system would be kicking in, right before. But if you were like a Zen Buddhist monk, right, you'd be way parasympathetic, right? But for most of us, it's just sort of, a balance, constant balance of any given system between these two, right? So this whole idea, right, that there's this balance is this dual innervation, right, by the sympathetic and parasympathetic. These organs over here, your heart, your lungs, most of your digestive tract stuff, your pancreas, right, the 2 exocrine and endocrine pancreas, the bladder, right, is going to be dually innervated. It has sympathetic innervation axons coming into it, postganglionic axons innervating, and it has parasympathetic axons innervating it. If one's going to increase your heart rate, one's going to slow it, right? If your airway is going to open, one of them is going to constrict. You're going to slow down your digestion because you need to shut it down to force all your energy elsewhere, or you need to increase it because everything's chill, right? During that running away from a snake, you don't want to be peeing all over yourself. So you stop that, right? Once you're all relaxed, you can pee. And I'll leave it to you to figure out how this fits into a fight or flight thing, but I haven't quite been able to make a good joke out of that, but there you go. Right, but each one, right? Dual innervation, right? Opposing effects. So here's an example. Right? You are sympathetic, parasympathetic, both of them are innervating the airway tubes, right? Your airways, these, what you would refer to airway, just where air is coming in, not where gas exchange is occurring, but to get air into your lungs, you got these airways. Sympathetic nervous system, what it does, fight or flight. Why do you want these open? Because you need more oxygen in the body. So these are wide open, your airways are wide open. And other things are happening. Obviously, you're breathing heavier, but this allows that air to get into the little air sacs for greater chance of oxygen exchange, right? So bronchodilation, right? Airways open, increase the air coming in, more oxygen is let in, more aerobic respiration for your muscles and your heart to occur, right? Whereas your parasympathetic, right, is actually, fact is when you don't need a lot of air in there, it's energy intensive to do all this. So when your parasympathetic kicks in, you're resting, you don't need to take in all that air. So these can constrict a little bit, right? And maybe even increase mucus secretion a little bit, so you'll get to that, what the function of that is once you get into your respiratory system in 145. But right, these are going to open or increase or decrease the influx of air, right? Dual innervation, opposing effects. And these are just examples, right? And these are good examples because these are ones you're going to have to, understand at some point. So another dual innervation, your heart is a big one. As I said, your heart is, we talked a little bit about this way back when we talked about the muscle tissue, right? Cardiac tissue. If you remove this heart from the body, you put it in a dish of appropriate solution, it'll pump by itself, right? It's auto-rhythmic. It's got its own sort of specialized conduction cells. You don't actually need this. In fact, if you transplant a heart into somebody else, this innervation is kind of hard to do. And I think it takes a while for it to grow back. So, but you could do it without that external innervation. So what this innervation does is increase or decrease the output of the heart. That is, it's going to make the heart pump faster and harder, right? When you need more blood circulating around the body in the sympathetic innervation, right? And then you're going to counteract that with the parasympathetic one, slowing it down, right? So you got this baseline rate of heart pumping, and you can increase it or decrease it based on these opposing influx, right? So how this would happen, it goes back to our homeostatic sort of reflex, these arcs, right? These homeostatic mechanisms where there is a stimuli, right? This increase in blood pressure, right? And then there are receptors, right, of some sort. And in this case, it's a baroreceptor, that is a stretch receptor in the blood vessel walls. When there's greater blood pressure, your walls are stretched out, and these detect that, right? Do that mechanical, remember their membranes were stretched, let in more ions. They pass that signal to the afferent, right? The afferent pathway fibers, right? The sensory neurons that were connected to them. Those went back up into your medulla, right? Your brainstem control center. Right, this is what we learned about way back, right? It's just a specific example. So your medulla oblongata is the control center, and it has a complex output, which is going to, go both to the sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? And in this case, we have an increased amount of blood pressure. And what we're going to do is decrease the sympathetic output and increase the parasympathetic output. Right, which means normally your sympathetic increases your contraction force. Right, that's what this ventricular myocardium means, like your pumping chamber. It's going to decrease, right? So the force of contraction decreases, right? And that's going to cause a decrease in the cardiac output. The other thing is the rate is determined by, like I said, they're autorhythmic, right? There's this place, don't worry about it, but there's right now, you'll have to learn about it later, but there's a group of specialized cells in your heart that set the pace, how fast your heart beats, right? Boom, 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 or boom, 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 boom. This is going faster or slower. This is the one that sets the pace, and you could increase it, right, with the sympathetic, but right now we're kind of decreasing this. So your heart rate goes back to normal and even less than normal because your parasympathetic output is increased. So the overall effect is that the amount of blood being forced out of your heart is less. That was going to decrease your blood pressure. When your blood pressure is decreased, this goes back to our receptor, and then it's going to tell your cardiovascular control centers in your brainstem to chill, right? Stop doing that. Right? It's homeostatic mechanisms. Right? So you'll be doing all this again, 145, it's good stuff. But this is the parasympathetic and sympathetic input. Well, here's a little bit more on that. Don't worry about the details here. I'm just kind of showing you, right? This is just an example, right? This is something you'll have to understand what these little bumps mean right here. But basically, this is showing, right, the heart rate as it goes on. In this case, there was like 3 in this 3-minute time period with parasympathetic input, right? Whereas with sympathetic input, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like it tripled it, right? During that same time period due to sympathetic input, right? So your heart rate is much faster, right? And this will be due, as we'll see, because one of these is going to hyperpolarize these cells so that instead of, this gray one over here, right, which you had 3 contractions in this time period, now it's like kind of slowed down, like to 2. The membrane, these are the action potentials in those. Right? So over here will be the opposite, right? The normal one is over here, 1, 2, 3. Now you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like per minute ultimately, right? Beating much faster. And this will all do because for whatever reason, we've hyperpolarized this, right? And so we slow down those action potentials. Now we've increased them, or the electrical signal rather going through the heart muscle. Don't worry about the details here. We're just looking at the opposite effects. So how do we get those opposite effects? We both have post ganglionic axons. They're both going to the same set of cardiac muscle cells. Right over here, right? Axon 1, axon 2, they're both spilling some stuff on there, both trying to affect it. But when this one talks to it, it slows down. When this one talks to it, it speeds up, right? So this has all to do with the particular neurotransmitters that each particular neuron is spilling out and which receptors are on those cells that are receiving those neurotransmitters.